Hello, friends, and welcome to the second episode of Trans Figures of History, the series where I draw portraits of trans people while discussing their historical significance. Today, we will be talking about Dr. Alan Hart. Dr. Alan Hart was a pioneer in developing the technique to use X-rays to screen for tuberculosis. He was an author, physician, radiologist, and one of the first transgender men in the U.S. to undergo a hysterectomy. Before we get started, I want to give a general content warning for a couple of the things I'll be discussing today. This includes eugenics, conversion therapy, suicidal thoughts, forced outing, deadnaming, and misgendering. The description will have all of the timestamps for the different sections, so please make sure to read that and skip ahead as needed. Hart was born on October 4th, 1890 in Halls Summit, Kansas. In 1892, Hart's father died of typhoid fever, and his mother moved their family to Lynn County, Oregon. She remarried when Hart was 5 years old, and their family lived on Hart's maternal grandparents' farm. Hart intensely disliked his stepfather and later sought psychiatric help as an adult regarding past traumas. However, Hart later wrote that this time spent on his grandparents' farm were some of the happiest years of his life. From the ages of 5 to 12, Hart wanted to wear boys' clothes, have male friends, and do work on the farm typical for boys. For the most part, Hart's family was supportive of his gender expression. His grandfather made him wooden toys that were meant for boys, and when Hart's grandparents passed in 1921 and 1924 respectively, both of their obituaries listed him as their grandson. Young Hart was different even then. Boys' clothes just felt natural. Hart always regarded himself as a boy and begged his family to cut his hair and let him wear trousers. Hart disliked dolls but enjoyed playing doctor. He hated traditional girl tasks, preferring farm work with the menfolk instead. The self-reliance that became a lifelong trait was evident early. Once he accidentally chopped off his fingertip with an axe. Hart dressed it himself, saying nothing about it to the family. In 1902, when Hart was 12, his family moved to Albany to give him a better education. He was made to present as a girl in school, but continued to present as a boy whenever visiting his grandparents' farm during the holidays. As was common for the time, Hart used a pseudonym for school essays and other writing pieces. He chose the name Robert Allen Bamford Jr., Bamford being his mother's maiden name. Women writing under men's names wasn't at all abnormal for the time, and Hart had numerous pieces published in local papers and school publications. These were written under his alias, an abbreviated form of his name, or as, quote, an anonymous boy. Hart attended Albany College, now Lewis and Clark College, where he met Eva Cushman, who was his first serious relationship. Prior to this, Hart had been attracted to plenty of women throughout his life, but had never thought there was anything abnormal about his sexuality, especially because he thought of himself as a man. Hart and Cushman completed their senior year at Stanford University before returning to Albany and graduated in 1912. During his undergrad years, Hart helped establish Stanford's first women's debate club. He was also part of the Albany debate team as well as the yearbook editorial staff. Hart and Cushman eventually grew apart, and Hart attended the University of Oregon Medical Department in Portland, where he obtained a Doctor of Medicine degree in 1917. When he graduated, Hart was awarded the Sailor Medal, which is offered to the graduate in the highest standing in all departments. He was the first woman at the time to receive the award. Hart returned to Stanford for some of his graduate classes in 1916, and during this time we know that he was frustrated his medical degree was to be listed under his birth name. It seemed that Hart had at least one ally among the university staff, as his graduation records were listed as Hart Lucille, aka Robert L., MD. Hart was concerned about linking his birth name and his pseudonym of Robert Bamford together because he was worried that were a prospective employer to look up his university records, they would see that those names were connected and know that he was not cis. And I think that that fear is why he later changed his name completely away from the Robert Bamford pseudonym. After Hart graduated in 1917, he went to one of his professors for psychiatric help. Joshua Allen Gilbert, PhD, MD, wrote an anonymous case study of Hart in which he is referred to as H. Content warning for this next section, we're going to be talking about Alan Hart's time in therapy. This section includes misgendering, eugenics, conversion therapy, and suicidal thoughts. So please feel free to skip ahead to this timestamp. Gilbert's case study is a really interesting read as well because it seems like he genuinely cared for Hart and wanted to offer him the best treatment possible that was available for the time period. So Hart initially went to his professor for help with a phobia of pop shotgun noises. Dislike for stepfather persisted. His teasing child with a pop gun and the association of him with her first hearing the report of a shotgun produced a phobia for that sort of a noise, which still persists at the age of 26. This phobia was her reason for first consulting me. Psychoanalysis revealed its underlying cause with unusual promptness and success. As stated earlier, prior to his relationship with Eva Cushman, Hart was unaware that his attraction to women would be considered unnatural. Hart agreed to undergo a kind of conversion therapy via hypnosis with Gilbert to remove his attraction to women. However, Hart stopped the treatment for fear that the therapy would not just remove his attraction to women, but instead for fear of being deprived of, quote, masculine ambitions and tastes with a consequent substitution of the characteristics common to the female. I find it really interesting that Hart didn't really seem to care so much about his sexuality, but had a very strong sense of gender identity. He didn't care if this conversion therapy would make him like men, necessarily, but he didn't want to risk no longer thinking of himself as a man. After stopping the attempted hypnosis therapy, Hart later approached Gilbert, ready to live full-time as a man. At this point in his treatment, Hart felt that his only options were suicide or to undergo sterilization and live as a man. At this point, it was well documented that Hart experienced terrible menstrual pain, supposedly from injury as a teenager. Given the time period, something like undiagnosed endometriosis wouldn't be surprising either. Regardless, Hart had discussed a hysterectomy with Gilbert to alleviate the pain. Gilbert was reluctant to perform the operation until Hart used a eugenics argument in his defense. Hart stated that if he could not be cured of his abnormal attraction to women, then the right thing to do would be to sterilize him so he would not be able to reproduce. Oh my god. That convinced Gilbert to perform the hysterectomy, agreeing that Hart's request was a noble decision. A relevant sidebar during this time is Carl M. Bayer, who was an intersex, assigned female at birth, trans man. He was the first recorded person to undergo sex reassignment surgery. The surgery took place in Germany in December of 1906. Bayer's case was additionally groundbreaking because he was also one of the first trans people to gain full legal recognition of his identity by receiving a reissued male birth certificate in January 1907. Bayer was treated by Magnus Hirschfeld, who is honestly one of the most important people in queer history and absolutely worth reading about. Just know it's also fucking depressing. His treatment would have been a groundbreaking procedure that both Hart and Gilbert were aware of, and likely something that Hart referenced regarding his desire for a hysterectomy. Unfortunately, all of the documentation of Bayer's procedure was destroyed during the Nazi book burning of the 1930s, which specifically targeted Hirschfeld's research. Hart underwent his hysterectomy by Gilbert in December 1917. Afterward, he cut his hair, switched his entire wardrobe to men's clothes, and legally changed his name to Alan L. Hart by January 1918. He wasted no time. Okay, content warning for this next section specifically is about forced outing, so feel free to skip ahead to this timestamp. There's a little bit of confusion for the timeline of this next part, so please bear with me. This all takes place in 1918 in Northern California and Oregon. Hart married a school teacher named Inez Stark in early 1918 and received his Oregon medical license by June of 1918. So in between all of that, in summary, Hart was working at a hospital, I believe in San Francisco, but I've seen different locations listed as well, where a former female classmate from Stanford recognized him. She immediately went to the senior staff at the hospital and the papers to out Hart, where articles were published to slander him. I'm wondering if that's the right use of the word slander, but I don't know that I care. It seems like the majority of the staff working alongside Hart were unfazed by it all, but Hart made the decision to move and leave the hospital for his safety. Unfortunately, this was the start of a long series of relocations that would occur whenever Hart's gender was brought into question. This put a huge strain on his marriage with Stark. They separated in 1923 and formally divorced in 1925. In the summer of 1925, Hart attended the University of Oregon to take writing classes, where he met Edna Ruddock. They married that year, and Ruddock became Hart's second wife wife and his lifelong partner. From 1925 for the rest of his life, Hart dedicated himself to researching the treatment and care for tuberculosis patients. Evidence of tuberculosis, or TB, has been found in prehistoric remains as old as 4000 BCE. By the late 1800s, it was understood that TB was caused by airborne bacteria rather than something genetically inherited. In the early 1900s, Hart and his contemporaries understood that numerous different illnesses were all actually cases of tuberculosis. Because of the rapid spread of TB, there was no cure by the time it reached the advanced stages when patients showed symptoms. The only hope in combating the disease was early detection. Hart believed that X-rays could provide early TB detection. X-rays were discovered in 1895 when Hart was only 5 years old, and they were primarily used to detect tumors and bone fractures. By the time antibiotics were introduced in the 1940s, Hart's technique of using X-rays to detect tuberculosis had reduced TB-related deaths to 1/50th of what they had been previously. In 1937, Hart was appointed as Idaho State Tuberculosis Control Officer, where he established the state's first fixed location and mobile screening locations for TB. He traveled across rural Idaho from 1933 to 1945 to educate and assist with TB screening techniques, and his work helped contain the spread of TB in the Pacific Northwest. In 1943, Hart compiled his tuberculosis research into a book titled These Mysterious Rays, a non-technical discussion of the uses of X-rays and radium, chiefly in medicine. This was the first book for the general public to understand how X-rays can diagnose and detect diseases such as tuberculosis, and it is still a standard book used today. Prior to this, Hart had published numerous short stories, poems, and articles since 1908. He published 4 fictional medical novels between 1935 and 1942, and the majority of his writings are reflections of gender identity and sexuality. Following World War II, synthetic hormones became available. Hart began taking testosterone as soon as he was given the opportunity in the late 40s. Hart and his wife later moved to Connecticut, and in 1948 he was appointed as the Director of Hospitalization and Rehabilitation for the Connecticut State Tuberculosis Commission, which was a position he held for the rest of his life. Hart set up statewide clinics and care in Connecticut similar to those during his time in Idaho, and similarly helped contain the spread of the disease. During this time, tuberculosis carried a social stigma. Hart understood this and instead referred to his clinics as chest clinics, himself as a chest doctor, his patients as chest patients, etc. Hart believed that discretion and compassion were key to helping treat the disease. For the remainder of his life, Hart gave numerous lectures and fundraised to support medical research for TB and to financially support patients with advanced TB who could not afford care. He passed away from heart failure on July 1st, 1962. He was 71 years old. After his death, Hart's wife established a research fund for leukemia, which his mother had died from. To this day, annual interest on their estate is donated to the fund to provide treatment and research grants. Hart's will stipulated that all of his personal letters and photographs be destroyed to hide his pre-transition identity. He was diligent about living stealth and did not want his private life to be shared. Hart lived exclusively as a man following his surgery in 1917. Content warning for this next section specifically includes misgendering and deadnaming. Feel free to skip ahead to this timestamp. In 1976, Jonathan Ned Katz published the book Gay American History, Lesbians and Gay Men in the U.S.A. Katz was the first person to identify H from Gilbert's case study as Hart. Katz interpreted Hart as a lesbian from the case study, citing that transgender care was, quote, quack medicine at the time. Hart's widow, Edna, refused interviews with Katz because she was so offended by his disregard for her husband's identity. Katz has since retracted his earlier statements, saying that he would not portray Hart as a lesbian today. However, Katz's original publication snowballed into people passionately defending Hart as a lesbian. Starting in 1981, the Oregon Gay and Lesbian Rights PAC began hosting a charity dinner named after Hart's dead name and raised over $100,000 annually. There was intense pushback from the trans and queer community to defend Hart's identity by asking the PAC to change the name of the dinner. This included numerous protests, including protesters wearing buttons, handing out flyers, and hanging banners, all with the message, "His name was Alan." The pack agreed to start a dialogue in January of 1996, and in March 1996 agreed to change the name of the dinner. Today, Dr. Alan Hart is considered to be a trailblazing transgender doctor whose work was widely influential in saving countless lives. I'd like to end this video with a quote directly from Hart about his decision to transition. This was part of an interview he gave after his forced outing in 1918. "I have been happier since I made this change than I have ever in my life, and I will continue this way as long as I live. I came home to show my friends that I am ashamed of nothing." What a fucking badass. There is a poll on my community tab where you can vote for which version of the final portrait of Dr. Hart you would like to see made into a sticker. Also, the Elagabalus sticker from my previous Transfigure of History video is up for pre-order on my Etsy shop, and a portion of the proceeds will be donated to the Transgender Law Center. Thank you all so very much for watching. If you would like to comment, like, share, subscribe, all that stuff helps me out a ton and I greatly appreciate it. As always, to my trans siblings, remember, we have always been here. I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye!